my first book was on economics of discrimination. Now, obviously, discrimination has been with the world ever since we've been able to record it. But interestingly, or maybe not, from your point of view, economists had really never dealt with that question. And virtually no treatment of that issue. And my judgment, the reason why that was so difficult, or why they neglected, I don't know about so difficult, was that in order to, you had to deviate from one of the principal traditional assumptions that firms, let's say companies, only want to maximize their profits. They're not concerned about the fact whether they're hiring women or blacks or Jews or anybody else. So anybody who comes along is the most productive for the same price, they'll take the more productive people. Or similarly for workers or customers. Well, that seemed to me to rule out too much behavior. We know there have been lots of examples where all these groups, the workers, the unions, the employers, customers, were willing to give up some money or whatever to exercise this hatred. And so what I tried to do, again, starting with the simplest formulation, take these feelings as just given, and say, well, how does that work itself out in the context of an economy where there's competition or monopoly, there may be unions or competitive labor markets, there are governments at work or not, and how do we go from this prejudice that different people feel to what we actually observe in terms of the, say, if you say blacks and whites, the earnings, the occupations, the unemployment of blacks compared to whites?
Well, let's stop for a moment and pick up something that is a staple of everyday conversation. That if people are born equal, then how do we explain that blacks earn less than whites? How much of that is due to discrimination? How much to other factors? How did you answer this question?
Well, what I tried to do statistically, and it was a very crude first effort, and since then there's been a lot more sophisticated work on this question. What I tried to do in order to test some of these ideas was to try to get measures of the productivity of blacks and whites and then compare their earnings when I sort of did my best to hold productivity constant. Now, productivity is difficult to measure, so I use concepts like education, years of schooling, region of the country, age, whether male or female, etc., and made comparisons, let's say, of white and black men of comparable years of schooling, comparable age, in the same region, maybe the same city, and tried to compare what their earnings were like, and found a sizable differential, though varied systematically with education and age and so on. Well, subsequent work, in which I've not participated, but there's a whole industry now working on this, I've tried to, make that more sophisticated. It's a very difficult question because, unfortunately, we don't have direct measures of productivity.
If a very strict market view were held, then employers would not discriminate on the basis of race or gender, but would seek to do the best they could for themselves materially. So perhaps you could just tell us, did you find this true or almost true or not true at all?
No. Well, certainly not fully true and probably not entirely true. That is, one of the points of departure of my analysis was to deny that proposition, to say that you could have perfect competition in the usual meanings of that term in economics, right, and nevertheless still have surviving in the market discrimination by employers. Now, competition would tend to introduce forces that could reduce the amount that would survive. The less discriminating employers would tend to expand. You'd have to pay the cost of your discriminating, because if you gave up hiring, let's say, a very productive woman in order to prefer a man, it would cost you to do that because you're giving it up. But nevertheless, that could survive. That was the point of my argument. It could survive under competitive conditions, and therefore, in order to believe that, let's say, in the U.S. economy, which is on the whole a competitive economy, not perfectly so, but on the whole certainly a competitive economy, and has been, that you could have in that economy, you did in fact have in that economy discrimination against particular groups, and therefore it could be perfectly consistent with competition. That was not understood by the economics profession. In fact, some economists still don't understand that proposition and act as if my analysis or similar analysis would lead under competition to no discrimination. It's just not true.
That's why I wanted you to bring this out.